Danny Frank for GNAT TV. If you're into fly fishing and hunting, we have a great show for you. We have a guest who is an icon of fly fishing and hunting, who lives locally in southern Vermont. And if you're not familiar with fly fishing and hunting, we're going to improve upon your learning curve. You're going to hear it straight from one of the icons, Tom Deck. Welcome to our show, Tom.
Thank you.
From Manchester, Vermont. And Tom, you have 4 books out, I believe.
Yep.
I guess this was the first one, the Orvis Streamside Guide to Fly Fishing,
Yep.
Fly Casting. And I guess this is sort of like a little pocket book where if you're out there and
Yep.
you don't know what to do or something, or you got to look up something in a hurry, right?
That's exactly it.
This is the guide, right?
Absolutely.
And then we have the Orvis Guide to Gun Fitting. We're going to find out about gun fitting. Again, Tom Deck, the author. And then we have the Orvis Guide to Beginning Wing Shooting. We'll find out about wing shooting with our guest, Tom Deck. And Tom, this one looks like the Bible, right? The
yes.
encyclopedia.
Well, that's it. That's an impressive way to look at it. But yeah, that's a very encompassing book there.
The Orvis Fly Casting Guide. So I guess if someone wants to get into this hot and heavy, this is it, right?
That'd be I would hope so.
Makes a great Father's Day gift or a Christmas gift or something.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So Tom Deck, how did you get into fly casting and fly fishing?
You know, it's an interesting question. I grew up, I'm a kid that loved to fish and loved to kind of wander around the local streams where I grew up. And I could still remember one day as a teenager, I was walking down there with my fishing tackle, and I saw a gentleman fly casting in the river, and I didn't really even know what it was, and I was kind of intrigued as to what he was doing, and I asked him, I said, wow, you know, that's an interesting way to fish, and he explained to me it was fly fishing and things of that sort. So from that moment, really, I became interested in fly fishing, and later that year I saved up some money and bought myself a fly rod, and I was kind of off and running at that point. So, yeah.
But why fly fishing versus, say, deep sea fishing or
worm fishing or
whatever?
It's a great question, and it's, you know, most people have this evolution when they start to fish. First they just want to catch a fish, and then they want to catch a lot of fish, and then you kind of get creative with it. You want to catch fish in maybe a different and interesting way, and I think just on my path to fishing, it was one of those things. I said, you know, that looks like a really interesting and challenging way to catch fish. It's certainly, fly fishing sometimes is a very easy way to catch fish, but the casting and some other things do make it a little more, the learning curve a little bit different. So I think it was just the challenge of trying to do it and catch fish in a different way is really what led me to it.
So how did you wind up here in Manchester, Vermont?
It's a great question. I used to come up here skiing with my family. I grew up in upstate New York, central New York area, and after college I simply moved here and taught skiing at some of the mountains locally, and that happened to be about 2 or 3 years after the movie A River Runs Through It, and fly fishing exploded in popularity, so that was fortunate for me. One of the other ski instructors was an instructor at the Orvis Fly Fishing School, and the school went from kind of, let's say, 700 students to 1,500 students a summer.
Really?
So the fly fishing, the movie The River Runs Through It, led to this big infusion, and so when the snow melted, I happened to luckily get a job teaching fly fishing, and it all kind of went from there. I ended up staying here now 18 to almost 20 plus years.
So I mean, are there any statistics or data like on how many people are into fly fishing or who have done it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of demographics out there. I mean, quite honestly with you, if you look at the demographic of fishing in general, fly fishing is a smaller segment of that. But But it is still quite popular. I mean, I think a lot of the manufacturers, and even Orvis would say, boy, we'd love to have another fly fishing movie. That would certainly help the popularity of it. But, I don't have any statistics necessarily at the top of my head, but it is a smaller segment of the fishing population or the fishing demographic in general.
And is it mostly males versus females, or younger versus older?
Yeah.
How does that break out?
I think the demographic is traditionally male. Middle-aged male, but we saw in our years at the Orvis Fishing School that there was a lot more women coming into the sport. Years ago, we estimated that was maybe almost 40% of the people that attended a school at Orvis were female, middle-aged females. And so the demographic is a little bit older, although there are younger people that kind of get into the sport, maybe college age and above, but it's primarily, an older male demographic in fly fishing.
So, Tom Deck, why is Vermont such a great fly fishing place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, really our whole valley of Manchester, the town itself, has grown up around the Battenkill River. And it was an iconic trout stream years ago, and many people would venture up here to exclusively fish the Battenkill. It was very famous for brown trout fishing. Still is to some extent famous for the fishery of the brown trout in the Battenkill River. And there's something, fly fishing tends to lend itself ideally towards trout fishing in rivers, and that's really the magnetism and the draw of Vermont centered around this Battenkill River Valley and some of the other streams. So it's, it really has a lot of nature, a lot of wild lands, a lot of freestone streams, and that lends itself to good fishing.
So what are some of the other states or places around the world that are known for fly fishing?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a saying about fish. That fish live in some of the most beautiful places in the world, and that's true. I just had a friend recently come back from New Zealand who went trout fishing. Great fishing there. In our country, you certainly have the New England states. You've got the western states of Montana is kind of a really popular destination. Obviously, there's Alaska. They have great fishing, tremendous natural resources up there, an abundance of fish and fishing opportunities. So, really anywhere, even the Florida Keys in the Everglades is popular with saltwater fishing, and Cape Cod has become a popular destination for saltwater fly fishermen. So it's really anywhere you have water, it turns out, people are really turning to fishing and fly fishing.
But isn't fly fishing usually rivers, streams, lakes versus ocean? I mean, I don't recall seeing
Right.
Fly fishing done on the ocean, right?
Yeah. It actually has become very popular
Really?
in the ocean. It originally developed as a fly fishing for trout in streams. Basically, moving water was kind of the origins of
And rivers.
And rivers is the origins of fly fishing. But it has grown. I mean, tackle has evolved, fly rods have evolved, the flies have evolved. So there's people that fish for tarpon and bonefish and sailfish. Big game species in the salt, and that is a very growing segment of fly fishing. So, anywhere there's wild fish to be caught, fly fishing, does have a place at times.
So like when you go, say, deep sea fishing,
Sure.
I guess, where you're saying, oh, I'm going for flounder or I'm going for tuna. Or
Right.
If you are going on an excursion in Vermont here, let's say we're going to Lake St. Catherine, for
Sure.
example. Are we going for a certain type of fish there? Is that...
Yeah, I mean,
Is that, or is it potluck where we, whatever comes along? How does that work?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, most of the time, a person who fly fishes is targeting a specific, fish. I'm going to go to Lake St. Catherine. I'm going to try to catch a brown trout by trolling my fly, behind the boat, or casting it off under the near the shore and working a fly. So you typically start out by targeting a specific fish, and maybe you might catch a smallmouth bass or a largemouth bass or a pike or something different. So it can be both, but I think it typically starts by saying, I'm going trout fishing, and that's how it begins.
And seasons, a fish affected by the season, certain...
Yeah, certainly the fishing is better certain times of the year, and most, fish, cold-blooded, depends on, the season in Vermont is basically spring to fall, spring, summer, fall, and a little more difficult, obviously, in winter. The fish's metabolism slows down. They're not as actively feeding, so it makes it harder to catch anyways. But yeah, I mean, the season is typically in the warmer months here in New England for trout, and again, it depends on the species. I mean, if you're bone fishing in the Bahamas, it might be December, could be early spring. So it depends on really what you're going after and where you are.
So local knowledge, how is that acquired? How does that work?
Very good question. Local knowledge and that's really it. Time on the water. The anglers that are really out there and fishing a lot.
Experience.
Yeah, experience comes into play. Fly fishing in New England here, and say the bat and kill, is pretty predictable. We know certain times of year in the spring, certain insects are going to be more prevalent in the stream, hence the fish will feed on those insects. So the savvy angler knows to match his fly to a certain time of the year when there's a better opportunity for a fish to see that as something recognizable and feed. So, and there's a lot of resources out there. There's hatching charts. It says, this time of year, these certain flies are going to be more prevalent. These certain insects are going to be more prevalent on the streams. I mean, sometimes literally down to the, that 2-week window. You could say, you can go in August in the mornings, and when the temperature's right, you know that a little fly called a trico is hatching off, and you could see fish rising and feeding to them. It makes the fishing a lot easier. So local knowledge and experience helps, but there's also a lot of resources out there that you can
Well,
find.
is this put out by the state, for example?
Yeah,
or
a lot of the states
one
do
of the federal agencies? How does that work?
Normally not them. I mean, Orvis is a good example. Their website would have hatching charts for various rivers. Let's say you're going to Montana, and you're going in a certain time of the month, and you could say, well, I'm going to be there this summer, and these are the flies that seem to be more prevalent, and you can load up on your assortment of flies either when you get there or before you go. And so it's usually, it's usually not the government agencies. It's usually companies like Orvis and maybe even volunteer groups that do that thing. And there's a lot written. There's a lot of writers that write stream guides or entomology guides or
a lot of blogging, a lot of
yeah,
buzz,
that's become popular. A lot of guys, you go on there and the guy will say, I fished this morning and it's such and such a section, and March browns, which is a typical fly, March browns were coming off, and I caught 3 fish. So that certainly is it's a lot easier. The learning curve or the experience level is much easier now just due to the information age, whereas the old savvy angler that fished the same water for 10 years accumulated that knowledge over that time. So it's interesting how technology is kind of changing the learning curve.
Now, you were telling me that a good fly fisherman has to study entomology?
Yeah.
Huh?
I mean, it's not required, but I think, the study of aquatic insects is really what entomology is, and that's really what we're trying to do as fly fishermen in New England here. We're basically studying what the river has, what types of bugs are prevalent in the stream, and that's really learning a little bit about the aquatic entomology of a stream, and that, surprisingly enough, can make you a better angler. You always know the really sophisticated fly fishermen that are quoting the Latin names of the bugs, like Paraleptophlebia, which is, you hear that and you're like, oh my goodness, but really it's not that complicated. That simply means it's a black quill, which would mean the Latin term for a black quill. And they're sold that way. You could go in let's say you read on a blog, I heard the black quill hatch is going on right now, and look on the board and there'll be black quills, and very easy to find. So it's not a necessity to be an entomologist to enjoy fishing, or at least fly fishing.
Now, fly fishing versus deep sea fishing versus bait fishing versus what? Spin fishing?
Yes.
I mean, what are the differences here?
Yeah, it's a good question in that fly fishing and lure fishing or spin fishing, you have a heavily weighted lure, and you're taking that lure and you're kind of flicking it out
and
there.
People spend a lot of money on these lures,
Sure,
right?
oh, yeah. Lures can be quite expensive. And what happens in the conventional fishing is the weight of the lure pulls the line off of your reel. Well, in fly fishing, we're casting, and I'll show you, we're casting, just for demonstration's sake, we're casting, this is a small fly, but this is virtually weightless. So In fly fishing, it's not the weight of the actual fly that propels it. We're actually using the line itself to unroll out onto the water. So you're casting the line versus throwing or flicking the lure. So it's different in a technique standpoint. Hopefully the result would be the same. You hopefully entice a fish, but the technique of casting is totally different.
And the fish is going to respond to this little thingamajig here?
Hard to believe, right?
Right?
Well, a fly would be, let's say in a certain circumstance, there's many natural insects on the water that look very similar to that. That would be the most effective way to get after that fish, as opposed to maybe throwing a big chunk of live bait. That might not work in that situation. If there's thousands of those in the stream, trout or fish in general are not very smart, but they are selective, and there's a difference. They know that the small little bug is safe right now, so they'll eat those. And that's why we would study and observe the conditions and choose a fly accordingly. And I know it's hard to believe it's such a small fly like that. You'd be surprised. You can catch a pretty good fish with that.
So what happens now when there's, say, a Hurricane Sandy or something?
Sure.
Does that change the conditions? Is that good for fishing? Is it lousy for fishing? Or?
You know, it's an interesting question in that we recently had floods here in Vermont. Big, devastating floods. There's a school of thought that every so often a scouring of the river or a cleansing of some of the parts of the river are good, and then there's some of that damage is really changed the nature of the stream, and so it's hard to say. The debate is probably still out there. I'd say some mild flooding is probably a good thing. Not very detrimental to the ecology of the particular stream. But big flood like the last one we had probably did damage to not only fish, but the aquatic population of bugs and things in the river. So,
yeah, go ahead.
And a little bit of rain is usually good. We want sustainable water levels in the rivers, and that's usually good for the fish.
And if we have a long, hot summer without rain, that's not good.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
it's very, fish are temperature sensitive, right? So they're cold-blooded, so if the water gets too over a certain temperature, the fish could actually perish. So we kind of want, cold water is usually a good thing for us in Vermont, and our trout streams in Vermont.
So you've brought some rods and reels here, Tom Deck, and what are we looking at here?
Well, I bought two distinctly kind of different ones. This would be what we call a 6-weight rod with a little bigger reel, and this would be for casting maybe some bigger, heavier flies. You could go after trout or largemouth bass, maybe even very, very light saltwater. And this would be a more typical of a traditional kind of sized trout rod. This is a 5-weight. And this is probably more attuned to casting the much smaller fly. So this is when you target a certain fish. Let's say I'm going to trout fish. There's certain rods that do a better job of it than others. And same with saltwater fishing. Bigger fish, we would need gear that's even larger in size than something like this.
So I mean. The difference in these rods or the reels here, what would the difference be?
Well, from a technique standpoint, very little. Casting is casting. If you can cast the line effectively, just a little more weight, a little more heft in there. So technique-wise, it's virtually the same. You can see the little thicker line on this one. That thicker line or heavier line helps cast heavier flies. So that's really the only advantage to it. The heavier the gear, the easier it is to cast those bigger flies that typically maybe bigger fish would be enticed by.
So someone who wants to get started with this, what do they typically have to go for to get going here?
I always jokingly
get
say,
all the equipment.
That's the thing. Orvis has been in business since 1856, and that's not by accident. There's no one perfect rod that does it all, and fly fishing in general is a pretty equipment-intensive sport. So if you like kind of gadgets and gear, fly fishing's perfect. But you can get away. Obviously, you have trout in your backyard or largemouth bass in your pond. Usually you go and you get a rod and a reel combo that is best suited for that particular type of fishing, and then you can get a smattering of flies and things like that. I always tell people, if you have some interest, taking a school is a great way to start because it gives you a good overview of the casting, gives you some overview of the equipment, gives you some overview of entomology and some other things. And in, you know, one weekend you could learn a real lot about, or really speed up your learning curve in fly fishing. So it's a good way to do it.
So is there some technique or something
Yeah.
to get a good cast to,
Yeah.
what do they do? Is it the wrist action or is it the arm action?
It's a good point. It's a little bit of everything. And really what we're trying to do with a fly rod, if you can notice, I just little movements here translate to a lot of big movements out at the tip. So it's really, there's a combination of wrist and forearm when you make a proper stroke, but it's a very simple action that's kind of difficult to do at first because it's one of those economy you know, of movements. It's like the golf swing. More is less. We tend to, a lot of people tend to come to school and want to force that thing out there and then throw it.
Give it a real.
Oh boy, and that's
the worst.
The worst thing you
right.
could do. You know, I always get a charge out of it. Usually, it's the, you know, the very you know, smaller built gentleman or maybe even a petite female that comes to the school, and in no time they're laying that line out there beautifully. And so there's a lot of technique in there. And a lot of counterintuitive technique. You know, it doesn't take a lot of muscle and strength to cast. It's actually a very gentle stroke can go a long way.
Now we've had a number of presidents, right?
Yes.
Who, I know, you know, fly fishing was their recreation or
I believe,
pastime, right?
I believe it was Theodore Roosevelt was a fly.
Theodore Roosevelt, Eisenhower, I believe.
Eisenhower,
right?
he was also a. There was a more recent president, it escapes me at the moment, but
Vice President Cheney,
Yeah,
Dick,
Vice President
Dick Cheney, right?
a big fly fisherman. I believe he has a ranch in Wyoming.
Yeah.
And yeah,
But Tom, you have to have a lot of patience, I would think. It's not as, with all due respect, exciting as, say, shark hunting or, you know, catching the big tuna or something, right? I mean, you could go, I think, all day and not catch anything, right?
Yeah,
There's a lot of
there's
solitude and passivity here.
There's a lot of times where it is simply sitting on the bank and maybe, you know, smoking a cigar or just simply watching the river flow by when there's not a lot of action. There's certainly times like that. There's also times that are very exciting. I mean, when you're trout fishing and you see fish rising on the surface, that's something tailor-made for fly fishing. And you know, there's something very interesting about when you cast a fly and it's floating on the water and all of a sudden the fish literally breaks the water to take your fly. Even though it might be a smaller fish, there's something really exciting about that. So, and maybe it's a contrast from that very peaceful, serene moment where you're just casting to all of a sudden, you know, a fish takes your fly and it's
But does it give you a good fight?
Sure.
You'd
be surprised. I mean,
get the energy going? Or?
Absolutely. I mean, I can remember taking people fishing for the first time, and they're, you know, we might have only caught, you know, 8, 10-inch fish, but as we released the fish, you could see the person literally, you know, shaking with excitement from catching their first fish. So even small fish, it can be pretty exciting. And again, in saltwater fishing, they fish for tarpon and bonefish and some of the bigger fish. And if you've ever seen a tarpon in the Florida Keys or you know, somewhere in saltwater, that thing leaps out of the water, and it's one of the most exciting types of fishing you can have. So it really can send the heart racing. But to your point, it is maybe a little bit more cerebral sport and a little more of a, you know, kind of passive sport.
We got to spend a little time on guns and
wonderful
gun fitting. Okay, I'm not really familiar with what I mean. Is it sort of like people get golf clubs?
Yeah.
They get fit for a gun?
That's exactly right.
Tell me.
Yeah. So it's just like if we walked into the store and we wanted to, you know, buy a custom jacket or go to get a pair of golf clubs. You know, you're going to be at your best when you have something that suits you. You're going to look your best when it has something that fits you appropriately. And that's really in shotgunning. And gun fitting is specific to shotguns, although you can do it with other types of firearms and rifles and things like that. It's really suited to building a stock or a dimension that really fits a shooter, and when they take the shot, all gun fitting means is when you bring the gun up and you take your shot, that the shot charge goes right where your eyes are looking. So in wing shooting, when things happen kind of quickly, there's no time to aim or, you know, line everything up. A gun that fits you, you simply bring it up, take the shot, and the shot charge goes where your eyes are looking. It's really just that simple.
So, I mean, a serious gun enthusiast, hunter, he should get fitted, right?
You know, I say anybody that wants to be more successful at shooting a shotgun, whether it's clays or shooting and hunting, upland bird, quail, any of those types of things, a fitted gun is really, you're only going to be at your best with a gun that fits you, and that's really something that you should keep in mind.
So, Tom Deck, wing shooting, we're talking about geese, we're talking about ducks probably, pheasant, grouse, woodchuck, I guess,
woodcock,
quail, right?
Yep.
So tell me a little bit about that.
I mean, wing shooting, the term itself refers to just that, hunting and trying to take game on the wing as the bird. Take grouse hunting in Vermont, for example. You know, hunter walks through the woods with his dog or without a dog, and the bird flushes up into the sky, and that's when the wing shooter takes his best shot at it with his shotgun, and that's really where the term comes from. But it's a wonderful pastime with a lot of history and tradition here in Vermont specifically, but the same with duck hunting and goose hunting. Waterfowling is a very popular sport with a lot of people showing great interest in it. So it's really what the essence of what it's all about.
And here again, is it becoming more popular, less popular as a sport, as an activity? Is it what's the acceptance of it these days?
Yeah, I think in certain segments, it's some wing shooting is really on the uptick. Waterfowling seems to have a growing trend. Grouse hunting here in New England, I think, is becoming a little less popular as the New England states become more populated. Populations of birds are fluctuating up and down. I mean, we're in a down cycle right now, so it's probably not as popular in New England as it used to be. But there's a big uptick in clay shooting. So places that have clubs where you have certain games where you shoot at clay targets and they break, and there's really no hunting involved in that. That segment of shooting is becoming very popular.
Now, on the end of all of this, between the fly fishing and the hunting, there's also the, I guess, cleaning and cooking, right? And preparation, that's an important aspect of this thing too.
Well,
right? To be able to enjoy your catch, right?
Absolutely.
And do you do some of that as well?
Yeah, I do. I fashion myself as a kind of amateur chef, and I particularly like waterfowl hunting. I hunt ducks quite a bit in the fall, and there's nothing better than me than preparing a couple of those dishes for my family and friends as the season kind of winds down. I have a freezer full of stuff, hopefully, and make it last throughout the year. It's also the right thing to do. If you're going to harvest the game, you kind of owe it to responsibly make use of that. So that's a big part of it, and a very enjoyable part of it. I mean, there's nothing more organic than some ducks that you harvested that morning. It's really a wonderful taste, and it's a great part of being a field is sometimes enjoying and reliving those hunts over a meal, or we often in the summertime might even do a little fishing and then have a streamside cookout right there with some of the fish that we.
So is this learning from a chef, or is it trial and error on your own, or what?
You know, it's funny, most of my best recipes have been handed down from other hunting partners and fishing partners. So for me, it's been acquired knowledge through friendship and through other people who had a little more experience than myself. So, but there's plenty of places to find great recipes for fish and fowl and partridge. There's all kinds of great recipes out there. And a lot of cookbooks out there, especially devoted to preparing wild game, which I think is interesting. It's a pretty popular segment right now.
So, Tom Deck on the fly fishing, Bat and Kill, good place,
Great
right?
place, a lot of history there.
Lake St. Catherine?
Yeah, Lake St. Catherine is actually a lot of big fish coming out of that lake as recently, so certainly a good spot. Lake Champlain.
Lake Champlain.
Great spot. I mean, if you go there on a weekend, and you'll see at the boat ramp, there'll be a lot of people up there fishing. a lot of people spin fishing or traditional fishing, but you also see people fly fishing. It's a very underrated fishing resource, in my opinion, that I don't think too many Vermonters and people in this area are aware of, because truly is a great fishery.
Hudson River?
Hudson River.
Yeah.
The upper Hudson River is particularly good fishing, and the lower Hudson is a little different, a little more complicated, but the upper Hudson does have plenty of good fishing in the Adirondack region there.
So, Tom Deck, if someone wants to indulge here, right? One of these books, the Orvis Fly Casting Guide, written by Tom Deck, one of the experts. You've seen it right straight from the source here. And the Guide to Wing Shooting, and that's written by Tom Deck. And Gun Fitting, written by Tom Deck, the Orvis Guide to Gun Fitting. And again, if you're stuck out in the lake there or the stream and you got to look something up in a hurry on fly casting, this little pocket guide is very effective, full of a lot of information.
Absolutely.
Right? So, Tom Deck, good to have you with us. Thanks for being a resident of Southern Vermont. And this is Danny Frank for GNAT TV.